Hello, this is Jason Balaban from HighSundry.com to talk about how I created bass traps for my home studio. Here is a list of the materials I used to create the bass traps. 1 inch by 2 inch wood for the framing, 1/4 inch by 3/4 inch strips for the front frame. To create these strips, I used a table saw to cut the strips from a larger piece of wood that was originally 1/4 inch by 6 inch by 48 inches. Owens Corning 703 rigid fiberglass or other absorbent material, Guilford's of Maine 701 fabric or some other breathable fabric, fastening devices for hanging our bass traps, wood glue, nails and screws, a miter saw, which is used to cut the 1x2s, and a table saw, if you need it, to cut the 3/4 inch strips. And lastly, a staple gun and staples. The first thing I did was create the back frame. Using the 1x2 pieces of wood, create the frame in the dimensions of the bass trap. In my case, I created them at 2 foot by 4 foot. Secure the corners with screws or nails or brackets, keeping in mind that this frame will provide the structural integrity for the trap. Once the frame was complete, I created posts to do 2 things. Firstly, they hold the front frame, which I will show you later. Secondly, they hold the rigid in place. Notice the orientation of the post. Notice how they alternate. As you will see shortly, this is important, so please pay special attention to this. Here's what they will look like when they're done. After I finished the post and the frame, I needed to create a barrier between the rigid and the frame itself so that the rigid wasn't exposed in the back of the trap. I accomplished this by putting a piece of fabric between the frame and the rigid fiberglass. Please take note that the fabric is not on the back side of the frame, but in between the frame and the rigid fiberglass. Once the fabric was in place, I put the rigid on the frame, trimming out sections for the posts. Now that the rigid fiberglass is on the back frame, it's time to create the front frame. Next, I used the 3/4 inch by 1/4 inch strips to create the front frame. As shown in this diagram, the alternating posts allow the front frames to have a place to be secured at all times. I secured the strips with a little bit of glue and a single nail. This is what they look like when they were done. Now that we have all our traps made, it's time to cover them. Before covering the trap, be sure to sand the corners. This will help prevent the fabric from ripping when you're stretching the fabric over the frame. I started by laying the fabric on a clean surface. I then put the bass trap on the corner and started to staple the first side. After the first side was done, I moved to the second side, gently stretching and stapling along the way. Now moving to the first short side, I took some time to create the fold. This is important and will go a long way. Again, gently stretching, I stapled the first side. Then I moved to the last side and took the time to create the folds and gently stretch while I stapled. Once stapling was complete, I trimmed the excess fabric. Here's a close-up of the fold. Taking a little bit of time creates a professional look. Now that our traps are complete and covered, it's time to hang them. To hang them on the wall, I chose to use 3 inch or 4 inch angle brackets. The angle brackets are sturdy enough so that I can mount the trap with space between the trap and the wall. On the bottom of the trap, I needed to create a little spacer to ensure the spacing at the top and the bottom was equal. Here's what they look like mounted on the wall. In this case, there's a 4 inch gap between the wall and the trap itself. For hanging on the ceiling, I just used plain hooks. To allow the traps to be mobile and or to be used on walls where the corner brackets could not be used, I created these little feet with 1x2s. The feet were fastened to the back of the bass trap using screws. The first thing I did when creating the Super Chunk corner trap was to create brackets for the front paneling which would cover the trap itself. Here's a picture of the brackets as well as the front panel, created with fabric and 1x2s. Because I didn't intend to fill the entire corner with rigid, I needed to create 2 shelves for the top corners of the super chunk. I created the shelf with a piece of plywood. Here's a picture showing the bottom, which is 12 pieces, and also the top. Notice that the pieces in the top are resting on the shelf. Here's a picture of the room after the super chunks and all the base traps were in place. I was very pleased with the final product, both from an acoustic and a visual perspective. For those of you that are interested, here's a close-up of the aquarium that's in the back of my control room. If you are interested in finding out more about these types of aquariums, please visit projectaquarium.com. If you'd like to create larger base traps, the same principles apply. Here's a 2-foot by 8-foot base trap that I built for another control room. Covering is a little bit more difficult, but if you take your time, the results are the same. Here is a picture of the control room with the 2 by 8-foot base traps. I added lathing to the base traps, which I thought was a nice touch. I am not going to go into great detail on how to create this trap, but I wanted to give a quick overview. Once the frames were created out of 1 by 10 pieces, I put the mass-loaded vinyl in place. Once in place, they were covered with rigid 703 fiberglass. Once that was in place, I covered them with more fabric and lathing. Here is a picture of the final product. I hope you found this video both educational and entertaining.